Hi everyone. All right. Sorry for the delay in getting the video to you today. Um, so today we are talking about Angela Davis's "Are Prisons Obsolete?" Uh, we discussed it already in class on Monday. A little bit of chapter one, but I'm going to try and give an overview of chapter one, chapter two, and then chapters five and six. And I may touch on uh, chapter three a little bit also, which was not assigned. Um, so as we discussed in class on Monday, right? Angela Davis is uh, asking a question. Obviously, are prisons obsolete? And what she's doing in this book is twofold. In the first place, she wants to present a history of the prison system, the prison industrial complex, as she calls it. And in the second place, or sorry, first place, history of the uh, prison industrial complex and its right racist roots. The history that she tells is a history of the racialization of punishment and the racial character of prisons in general. The second thing she wants to do is more generally to think about alternatives to dealing with lawbreakers, alternatives for alternatives to punishment, right? Not maybe alternative forms of punishment, although that's a question also, but more essentially alternatives to punishment. Uh, and so in chapter one, she starts out with sort of weaving these two themes together. Right? And she starts by asking, as we discussed in class, um, you know, if we can imagine a world without the death penalty. She begins with this comparison between the death penalty and prisons in general. Right? We can imagine a world without the death penalty. Uh, right? Many countries, many states don't have the death penalty. And when the death penalty is taken away, right, we don't think that there is a huge spike in crime, right? Countries that don't have the death penalty, states that don't have the death penalty, don't have higher crime rates than the places that do have the death penalty. So, if the death penalty is supposed to, prevent crime, it would seem that it doesn't, right? Because there's no difference between a state that has the death penalty and doesn't, and one that doesn't. Um, she says we can imagine life without the death penalty, but we can't imagine life without prisons. Prisons seem unavoidable. They seem, as she said on page 10, natural. Prison is considered so natural that it is extremely hard to imagine life without it. And this fact of prison seeming natural is interesting. Right? We seem to believe that prisons are the only way. Wherever there is law, there must be prison. Uh, and I think this ties into her larger argument about what prisons really are. Um, we're we're led to believe uh, that prisons are inevitable. We're allowed to believe that prisons are inevitable, but that belief, the idea that prisons are natural, is a product of a particular uh, historical era and a particular ideology. Uh, our belief that prisons are natural, she says, uh, ties into, or is in part caused by the rhetoric uh, around the law, around law and order, right? What law means in a liberal democracy in the modern world, and particularly in the 20th century in America. Uh, so we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but for now, she says, right, why do we think prisons are necessary? Why do we think that punishment is necessary? Because we have this uh, phrase drilled into our minds: crime and punishment, right? If there is crime, there must be punishment. There is crime, therefore there must be punishment. Crime and punishment, crime and punishment. We hear this so frequently that we feel that there is a natural causal relationship between crime and punishment, right? Uh, and so, I think the point is that this belief that prisons are inevitable and necessary and natural is an ideological point, a rhetorical point, a propagandistic point. It's something that is drilled into our minds, um, and uh, we'll come back to this. But for now, I think it's just interesting to acknowledge the inevitability of the concept of prisons in 20th and 21st century America, and more generally, right? We should always be skeptical of that which presents itself as natural, and the naturalness of it points to not its genuine necessity, right, physical or social necessity, but rather to the scale of the system and institutions that are invested in prisons. Okay. Um, all right. Prisons are natural because they are essential to our conception of the state. Prisons are what the state does. She writes on page 11, short of major wars, mass incarceration has been the most thoroughly implemented government social program of our time. And it's interesting to think of prisons as a social program, right? Uh, Government is about, right, managing society, and government, right, what is a law if not in some sense a social program, an implement with which to shape society uh, and the world. So prisons are a social program, a means of regulating society, of controlling the world, of exerting power over the world. Uh, and the state, the US state, uh, other, most modern states, has directed much of its energy resources to social control through incarceration. Right? That incarceration is the primary means of social control, the most consistently implemented social program. So, the she says, short of major wars, incarceration, imprisonment is the most consistent sort of social program, right? Which is an interesting framework to think about prisons. Now, I think now is a good moment to bring up what is really kind of the most hotly debated and sort of mainstream point in the debate about prisons. Uh, and it is not, a question that is specifically about prison abolition, which is Angela Davis's project or topic here, but also just about prison reform, right? Which is uh, not only do prisons rehabilitate people, which is another hotly debated question, but more fundamentally, what makes people break the law in the first place? And we touched on this a little bit in class. We were talking about the causes of crime, whether or not prison is a crime reducer or in fact increases crime, that going to prison, being in prison, increases the likelihood that you will break the law again, right? We saw that the recidivism rate is 43%, which means that you know under half of all prisoners go on to reoffend, right, and wind up back in prison again. So the numbers for rehabilitation don't look too good, right? Um, the understanding why people break the law, why people go to prison, is more difficult, right? Uh, for Angela Davis, excuse me, God. For Angela Davis, right, the vast majority of crime, of law breaking, is a product of uh, circumstance, product of, right, either economic deprivation, right, that people don't have enough money to live, and so they resort to crime of one kind or another, uh, or, right, a more general product of social degradation, right? That we don't have the social safety net, we don't have the social programs that we would need in order to give people the help uh, that they need and deserve in order to prevent them from committing crimes, right? So we can think of white collar economic crimes, robbery, burglary, muggings, any crime that is motivated by the need for money as a product of an economic system that has failed a great many people. And we could also, chalk up a large number of, sort of more, more sort of what we think of it as crime, right? Violent crime, uh, such as, assault, um, attempted murder, uh, rape. Many of these crimes, she thinks, um, or the argument goes, are also a product uh, of social degradation, right? That if and social and economic degradation are absolutely linked, right? That if your, for example, right, father goes to prison and your mother is working three jobs to try and provide for you and your siblings, and you're left with your creepy uncle who, abuses you or whatever, right? That is, uh, from one perspective, a symptom of social degradation, social decline. That it is society's job, and that, as we'll see at the end, one way to prevent crime would be to take care of people before they become driven to crime, right? So social safety net and programs would prevent people from being driven to other crimes, right? From being traumatized, you know, alienated from the world, living meaningless, um, meaningless lives, uh, all the things that might drive a person to violent crime. Um, so generally, right, for Angela Davis, crime is a symptom of society that is not functioning well. Crime is not primarily um, something that is in the nature of human beings. And I think that there's a counter argument to be made here. We talked about this a little bit in class also, right? That there are certain individuals who have had, plenty of economic stability, a loving family, no social or economic hardship, who nevertheless become criminals, right? Uh, I think, sorry, I think it's certainly conceivable that there's, um, an innate drive to law breaking, an innate drive to, uh, subversion of norms, and you know, what's the word? Right, breaking taboos, doing the bad thing, uh, and that just is the case with certain people. So I think we can have one discussion about people like that, but I think that the important point here is that the vast majority of people who are in prison are not like that, right? That's not their story. The vast majority of people that are in prison are there. The crimes they've committed can be explained through, um, economic, social uh, deprivation of some kind. Uh, you know, I think connected to this, certainly this is a point that Davis brings up several times, um, is uh, is mental illness, right? Mental health. That uh, a very large number of incarcerated people are also mentally ill. Right? There are more uh, mentally ill people in prison than there are in mental health facilities. And so, that is a sort of clear-cut example where we could say, does a mentally ill person who is not in control of their own actions, who's struggling with schizophrenia, say, right? Do they belong in prison? Right? Do they deserve to be punished, or do they deserve to be helped? Is what they need punishment, or is what they need treatment? And the fact that there are so many mentally ill people in prisons is, sort of indicates or uh, illuminates the way that regardless of the circumstances that lead to the crime, that is to say, regardless of which systemic and um, you know sort of natural uh, factors are genuinely to blame, right? That it's the individual who ends up being punished, right? That doesn't matter what your upbringing was like, doesn't matter, um, you know, that you were so poor that you had no alternative but to sell drugs or whatever the story is, right? You're an individual, you made the decision, therefore you're going to be punished. Uh, and so, in the case of mental illness, I think we can say, well, yeah, the individual did the crime, right? But the circumstances were such that they weren't in their right mind. They weren't really thinking for themselves. They were driven to do this by this external force. Um, and we see that the prison nevertheless punishes them as individuals, where we might say it's horrible that this happened, whatever the crime is, but this individual, you know, didn't set out to do this intentionally. There were, extenuating circumstances that led to this. We can see with the case of mental illness more clearly, right, that the prison is not the proper way, perhaps, to deal with a mentally ill person who commits a crime. And one of Davis's points would be, well, why don't we extend that, or we should extend that, to think about other extenuating external forces that lead people to commit crimes, and the way in which people who commit crimes were sort of driven into those crimes, didn't choose them, didn't choose to be criminals, right? That they weren't acting as Kantian rational agents, but rather as um, you know actors enmeshed in circumstances, who you know don't have the luxury of complete autonomy. So prisons uh, are, in the first place, um, not effective at rehabilitation, right? The thing that they are supposedly supposed to do. Uh, and in fact, right, the whole application of imprisonment as a punishment uh, is problematic and, um, in some senses, contradictory. Uh, People are punished for things that are not entirely their fault, or uh, that who would benefit from treatment from other forms of remediation. Uh, and finally, prisons, right, contribute to the social degradation and the economic degradation that pushes people to crime and into prison in the first place. Right? Uh, the fact that, right, coming out of prison, if you've been convicted of a felony, it's extremely difficult to get a job. Well, why? Why would that be to anyone's benefit? Why would it be to anyone's benefit to prevent an ex-convict from getting a good job? Right? The good job is their route out of more crime. So if prison prevents people from getting jobs, then prison is, likely a factor in people returning to prison, committing more crimes. Um, Now, maybe this is a good transition into the next topic, uh, because why does prison not care about your uh, economic situation? And why does it not care if you get a good job after you come out of prison? Right? Why does the state not care about these things? Right? Because uh, ultimately, the state is the one sending people to prison, obviously. Why does the state not care? And one answer, Angela Davis's answer, is that the prison is there uh, in fact, to prevent people uh, from getting decent jobs. Right? Prison is itself uh, a form of labor, right? Which is to say, prison populations have throughout history also doubled as labor forces. Right? And this is really the key, I think, uh, to understanding the whole argument here. The connection between racism, capitalism, and prisons. That prisons are factories, and prison populations are workforces. Now, this gets us into that large system uh, that makes imprisonment seem like a natural consequence of crime. It makes crime also seem natural, like a natural human event. Right? She writes on page 16, what, for example, do we miss if we try to think about prison expansion without addressing larger economic developments? We live in an era of migrating corporations. In order to escape organized labor in this country, and thus higher wages, benefits, and so on, corporations roam the world in search of nations providing cheap labor pools. This corporate migration thus leaves entire communities in shambles. Huge numbers of people lose jobs and prospects for future jobs. Because the economic base of these communities is destroyed, education and other surviving social services are profoundly affected. This process turns the men, women, and children who live in these damaged communities into perfect candidates for prison. Right? So, uh, in the first place, we see the way uh, global capitalism leads to the impoverishment of American communities. Right? Uh, and right, the global political economy, global corporations, uh, you know, shut down factories in Texas, in Georgia, and California, where have you, and move their factories to China, to Vietnam, to the Philippines, right? Where there is cheap labor, where they don't have to pay health benefits, where right, environmental regulation is less stringent, labor uh, laws are less strict, etc. Right? So corporations abandon their factories in the US uh, in search of uh, lower costs for labor. Right? That is the capitalist you MO. Uh, in their wake, right after they leave, when the factory is shut down, right, the jobs are gone. And what happens? People fall into poverty. Uh, those factory jobs, which were unionized, right, which paid fairly well, which gave benefits, all the things that the labor movement fought for decades and decades. The corporation then gets to escape by moving overseas, and the laborers are left without a job. Right? Maybe they get hired part time at the Walmart that opens. And that part-time job isn't going to provide benefits, isn't going to give you health care, and it's going to give you an hourly wage of right 775, 725. Right, so your community, everyone who worked at the factory, is out of work. Everyone in that community is impoverished. What happens for those who can't get a job at Walmart, can't get a job doing anything else, right, and even those who do get these less these worse jobs, right, are going to have economic deficits to deal with. How do you deal with that? If you can't get a straight job, maybe you turn to crime of some kind. Right? So corporate culture, global capitalism has led to impoverishment, and impoverishment leads to crime. Right? But the other important thing here is to recognize, right, that what corporations are looking for is cheap labor, right? A labor pool that you don't have to pay benefits, where labor laws are weak, and that you can pay dirt wages. When we think about that, right? And this capitalist motivation, capitalist right, modus operandi, um, then the fact that prisons are also labor camps, not labor camps in the sense of, in Siberia or in um, communist China, or not in the sense of working on the chain gang in the United States, right? We don't have to look at any other models, right? We can look at the chain gang in the U.S. That's a labor camp. Uh, U.S. prisons are not labor camps in that sense, although the distinction between those more brutal labor camps and prison labor is, not not that bolded. Um, Prisons then supply something. Right? They supply cheap labor. They supply a labor pool that has no life outside of labor, outside of work. So corporations, right, uh, shut down. They shut down the factories in the U.S. They move factories to where labor is cheap overseas, but they also then uh, more and more begin employing uh, prisoners, using the prison population as a labor force. Right? Uh, the expansion of prisons uh, begins in the 1960s. Right? There's a sort of initial boom uh, of prison expansion in the 1960s. Slows down in the 1970s, and then it shoots up and skyrockets in the 1980s. And it's in this same time period, right, that corporations are increasingly moving their factories overseas, increasingly looking for ways to avoid the labor laws and environmental regulations and the higher pay rates in the U.S. that have been negotiated by unions, etc. Right? So that we can think of the expansion of prisons as an alternative method of finding a cheap labor pool. Right? Uh, and this obviously is going to tie into private prisons. Right? The fact that, you know, increasingly beginning also in the 1980s, but really this has skyrocketed in the last 15, 20 years, even after Angela Davis is writing this in 2002. Uh, private prisons skyrocket. Right? And what are private prisons? Prisons that are literally for profit. Right? Prisons built with the intention of making a profit. So why are private prisons being built? We're told it is because we have too many prisoners. Right? But private prisons are being built privately rather than with public funds, so that all of the profit from those prisons can, go to corporations. Uh, and so this gets into, um, another question. And all right, I'm just going now. Uh, if there's this enormous expansion of prisons that begins in the 1960s, and then in the 1980s begins a constant uptick, right? And there are more and more prisons built in the United States, especially beginning in the 80s. Uh, we're told that this is because there are more prisoners that need to be housed there, right? more and more prisoners. And this gets us into kind of chicken and the egg question of crime and punishment, of prisoners and prisons, of criminals and prisons, which is that in order to produce so many more prisons, what you first have to do is produce many more criminals. Right? In order for there to be the expansion of prisons, you need to have more criminals. How do you create more criminals? Right? That is the problem. Are we to believe that beginning in the 60s and then in the 80s in particular, and so forth, there was an uptick in the inherent criminality of people, right? And this makes me think, right? I mean, we inherently acknowledge the fact that crime is a symptom of social dysfunction, right? Because we recognize that crime goes up when things aren't working in society. Now, if we look at the 1980s, however, right, at the beginning of the 1980s, as Angela Davis notes, right, crime is actually on the decline. Right? Just when this prison expansion really begins, crime is in fact on the decline. And this is a problem, right? Because we need more criminals in order for there to be an expanded prison system and an expanded labor pool. How do you create criminals? You create criminals by criminalizing things and by enforcing the law as strictly as possible. It's not that the laws remained the same and that law enforcement remained the same and that the prison population spiked. Rather, right, the laws are changed and enforcement of laws is intensified. The most famous example of this is the disparity between sentencing for crack cocaine and powder cocaine, right? In the 1980s, right when crack was becoming an issue, a law was passed that said it was, a much worse offense to be in possession of crack cocaine and powder cocaine. And the law was written such that possession of the same amount of crack cocaine led to a 20-year sentence. Right? And that same amount of powder cocaine was a 5-year sentence. May not have my years exactly right there, but it was, I believe, 4 times more severe, the punishment for crack cocaine. Now, in that snapshot, right, you have 2 drugs. Each of them presumably is, what's the ultimate difference between those 2? The justification was that crack is a more addictive, more dangerous drug, but we know that cocaine is also extremely addictive and dangerous. Right? So why would one drug have such a steeper penalty than another? We could maybe the place to begin here is actually, why are drugs illegal in the first place? Right? What is the war on drugs? Uh, and why are drugs criminalized? Um, if we go back and look at the beginnings of sort of drug culture in the US, uh, what we find is um, right, the distribution of heroin in the 1940s and 50s. And heroin was introduced uh, to the US, uh, in major quantities by the CIA, right? And having just said that, I know I need to back it up, and in fact, I don't. I'll remind me. I'll try and find the source for this. This is a well-known fact, right? But it's not a well-discussed fact. But the CIA was, dealing in heroin, in order to support its covert actions, right? There's a whole sort of secret history of the CIA, and their dealings with Afghani poppy farmers, and the heroin trade goes back, you know, before the 1950s. So the CIA was, involved in the heroin trade in order to make money to fund its covert actions. And where did it distribute heroin? It distributed heroin into Black populations, particularly in Harlem, and particularly in jazz clubs, right? So, there's this influx of heroin in the United States, and that, drug is injected into the Black community. In particular, and this is why you have all the jazz greats of the 40s and 50s are heroin addicts, right? Why Charlie Parker was a heroin addict, right? John Coltrane was a heroin addict for a little while. Heroin was an enormous part of the early jazz scene, and that was because of this influx of heroin that was distributed by the CIA, that came from the CIA. So the point of this is to, point out that there's this long history of the government using drugs as a way of sort of controlling, in particular, the Black population. Right, the criminalization of marijuana in the 1960s was explicitly aimed at controlling the Blacks and the hippies. Right, there's some famous quote from a senator who said, right, it has to be illegal. The only people that will go to jail for it anyway are, the Black people and the hippies who smoke it. So the drug laws were always, understood as a form of control, of controlling populations that were viewed as oppositional to the establishment, right? And above all, a method of controlling the Black population. And the hippies who, sympathized with the civil rights movement and things like that. If they, smoked grass, then they would go to prison also, and there was no love lost there. So when we arrive in the 1980s and we have this disparity between crack and powder cocaine, where is crack cocaine most prevalent? In the inner city, in Black neighborhoods, in urban areas. And look, there are, also conspiracies out there. I'm not going to say that this is, I haven't read anything that is conclusive on this. So, I shouldn't even probably mention this, right? But there's certainly, conspiracy and reason to believe the conspiracy might be have a germ of truth to it, that uh, the U.S. government and U.S. intelligence was in part responsible for the crack epidemic in New York and in cities in the United States in the 1980s also, right? They were certainly involved in the heroin trade in the 40s and 50s. It's perhaps not so unreasonable to think that they would have been involved in cocaine and crack cocaine in the 80s. The CIA was certainly involved in a lot of covert, secret, and anti-democratic activity in the 1980s that is, uh, for the most part, impolite to talk about in establishment in mainstream discourse. I've got my tinfoil hat on today. Um, so why? Why would there be this disparity between crack and powder coke? Uh, and the answer, obviously, is that um, a punishment that is harsher on the Black community, right, is going to produce the kind of prisoners that the state wants, right? That sort of the abstract ideology of state wants. I'm not, and I don't think Angela Davis. I don't think what's at stake here is not per se individuals making the argument. Certainly, we need to write really harsh drug laws in order to imprison a greater number of Black men, because we need cheaper labor to produce things in the prison work programs. No one is saying that explicitly. Instead, right, this is the whole thing about racism and the way that it transforms, takes on different forms through history. You don't need to say that, right? There's no need to explain. And in fact, the logic of it should never become explicit. It only works when it's implicit. It only works when you say, right, we are sending these drug offenders to prison for their own good, right? When the, explicit argument is anti-racist, right? We need to clean up the streets, right? We need to crack down on crime. And in the 1990s, with the crime bill, which instated the 3 strikes and you're out rule, which was sort of the beginning of the real age of intense mass incarceration, the 92 crime bill, right, which Joe Biden was a major author of. In that crime bill, you had a lot of Black leaders also saying more or less the same thing, right? We need these laws. We need this harsh punishment in order to protect our communities, in order to, root out the bad elements. So you have to have this party line, right? Prison is rehabilitative. We're sending people to prison to help them, and yet the logic of it, right, the way it works, if you put it together with this longer history, is very different. Right? We see over and over again efforts to criminalize, through whatever means possible, Black life, right? And by criminalizing, making criminals of Black people, the state, right, controls them, continues to have control over them, continues, more specifically and importantly, to control their labor power, right? Because when they're imprisoned, the state is once again in control of their labor power. And so this is the sort of final point in the first chapter, right? That prison has always been, um, or the growth of prisons, the fact that prison has become this most consistent social program of the state is uh, can be tied back to the end of slavery, right? And the question on you know white minds, what is going to happen to all these former slaves, right? Uh, if you are, right, a slave owner, if you are a plantation owner, or if you're just a average racist in the mid 19th century, uh, the prospect of all these former slaves now being free is, I think, on the one hand, uh, viewed as a threat, right? Uh, After all, right, they'd just been spending the last 200 years torturing, enslaving, and submitting uh, this group of people to the most horrific conditions imaginable. Uh, when that group is freed, you know, inevitably there's going to be a fear of retribution. But the more important point here, and I think the real driver, certainly what Angela Davis is concerned about, is the second sort of response to the freeing of the slaves, right? Which is, how do we get control back? How do we get power back? Right? It's not, oh, uh, right, slavery is over, and now, right, Black Americans are free. Okay, right, we lose, right? Uh, it's instead, we lost the war, but we're going to keep fighting. How do we keep fighting? How do we win control back? Uh, and the first answer to this was through, on the one hand, we had indentured servitude, right, which is slavery plus minimal wages, essentially identical to slavery, but without, you know, um, the indentured servant has uh, rights uh, and has to be paid, a very minimal wage. The other major way that you, as a white supremacist American in the 19th century, the way that you get power back, you regain control over the freed Black population, is through prison. And so what you do is you create a lot of laws uh, that are only going to really affect the recently freed slaves. Right? And the most famous of these laws were the vagrancy laws, laws that made it illegal to essentially live without having a job, right? Or to be a vagrant, to be unemployed, to be homeless, to be hanging around town, whatever. And these laws were only applied to Black people, right? And as a result, many people were thrown in prison. Once in prison, they were, right, put to work. At the end of the 19th century, the decades after slavery, there was right, a very robust prison work program, uh, building the railroads, doing all sorts of stuff, right? And that labor was essentially, right, um, or what happens in that situation is that those freed slaves are essentially enslaved again, right? But this time through a different legal means, through criminalization of certain behavior, the creation of criminals, and then the punishment of those criminals. And that punishment just happens to turn a profit for the former slave owner. Uh, so, what is accomplished by uh, regaining control of the black population through imprisonment is not just um, economic. Right? It's also social and political. Uh, and Angela Davis ends the second chapter um, by mentioning the political consequences. Right? Because as we mentioned, both in class and earlier, the consequences of going to prison are far reaching. Uh, in most states, or in many states, uh, actually, I'm not sure, in some states, certainly, I think in many states, uh, if you've been convicted of a felony, you can never vote for president again. You can never vote. Right? Why? Why would that be part of it? Right? We hear explanations of this, right? Well, if you don't abide by the rules of society, then you don't get to participate in society. All right. Um, you know, that it's a strange idea, right? Uh, that because you made a mistake, you now no longer have the right to do good. Right? We won't allow you to do anything that might be good, that might allow you to have meaning in your life because you made a mistake. Uh, and the, you know, even then, right, the punishment for the crime is the prison. The prison is supposed to rehabilitate you. So if you get out of prison and then you're told you are no good, you're not good enough to participate in democracy, well, then obviously prison isn't about rehabilitation. It's not about anything other than punishment. And it goes further, obviously, right? Why this particular additional punishment? Uh, if we recognize that prisons are uh, designed to control the black population and keep them, you know, from achieving genuine liberation in this country, then denying prisoners the right to vote is a critical part of this process. Right? Uh, Angela Davis writes, she's writing in 2002, right? In 1990, the Washington-based Sentencing Project published a study of U.S. populations in prison and jail and on parole and probation, which concluded that 1 in 4 black men between the ages of 20 and 29 were among these numbers. 5 years later, a second study revealed this percentage had soared to almost 1 in 3. Right? Moreover, more than 1 in 10 Latino men in the same age range were in jail or prison, or on probation or parole. The second study also revealed that the group experiencing the greatest increase was Black women, whose imprisonment increased by 78%. Okay, so right, 1 in 4, and later 1 in 3 Black men between the ages of 20 and 29 are in prison, jail, on parole, or probation. Right? A quarter to a third of the Black male population, and as she states, right, the Black female population in prison is skyrocketing. Right. Now, first of all, we want to note the structural violence, structural racism of this. Right? The prison population still today is 34% Black. Right? 34% of the prison population is Black. And you might say, well, that's only a third, right? How can we say the prisons are just about controlling the Black population or are this racist project? Right? There are, 29% is Hispanic, right? I'm sorry, 24% is Hispanic, and 29% are white. Now, we might say, right, it's just a third. It's not like 80% of the prison population is Black. But, right, more than 50% of the prison population is non-white. And what's really key here is the proportions. Right? So 34% of the prison population is Black, but only 12 to 14% of the overall population is Black, which means, right, that the percent of prison population that is Black is almost 3 times higher than the percent of the general population that's Black. Why? Why is that the case? Right? It would seem Black men in particular are sent to prison at a rate 3 times higher than whites. Right? In that you would expect, if all things were fair, that the prison demographics would roughly match general demographics. The fact that they don't is evidence that something is amiss here. Now, if we accept that, and I think there's ample evidence to demonstrate that Black people are imprisoned at much higher rates, that laws have been written throughout history with the specific intention of criminalizing the Black community, then we can, it's not difficult to then connect the next dot and say the reason why it is, or one of the motivations for why it is illegal for ex-convicts to vote is an attempt at voter suppression, right? To prevent Black people from voting, to prevent Latinos from voting, right? These groups that are criminalized and sent to prison are then permanently excluded from determining the direction of the country, right? As Angela Davis writes on sorry, I just had it. Writes on page 38. In Alabama and Florida, once a felon, always a felon, which entails the loss of status as a rights-bearing citizen. One of the grave consequences of the powerful reach of the prison was the 2000 election of George W. Bush as president. And if only the black men and women denied the right to vote because of an actual presumed felony record had been allowed to cast their ballots, Bush would not be in the White House. Right? That there are concrete political consequences to this. That by denying, uh, you know, 1 in 3, 1 in 4 black men the right to vote, you can really change election outcomes. Right? You can permanently disenfranchise a population, prevent them from participating in the government. Right? And so you get, George Bush, who expands private prisons, who um, begins a number of policies, that are devastating to the working class, the black population, etc. The system perpetuates itself, and it perpetuates itself because it disenfranchises and prevents those who would change the system from participating. Um, Now, I want to touch on one more issue that I think is interesting here, which is the nature of prisons, how prisons work. Uh, and, I was thinking about this, right, the idea of the naturalness of prisons. And I was thinking, well, there were always prisons, right? You read Plato, Socrates sits in prison. And there's a Platonic dialogue that takes place in a prison. So there have always been prisons. And Angela Davis says, yes, there have always been prisons. But prisons were always waiting rooms, essentially, holding cells before your true punishment. And I think that's exactly right. That prisons were, in the case of Socrates, for example, he was in prison, but only because he was awaiting execution. Execution was the punishment. Prison was ensuring that the punishment is carried out. And she says this, she writes, for a person in the medieval period, or even the early modern period, prison would not have been a punishment. Right? Prison provides you with shelter. It gives you food, and you aren't physically tortured. So prison is not a punishment. The punishment is the flogging. The punishment is being tarred and feathered. The punishment is being drawn and quartered. The punishment is being executed. The punishment is exile. Right? Prison wasn't a punishment. So there were prisons, there were jails, there were holding rooms, but those weren't themselves punishments, and they wouldn't have been legible as punishment to the medieval and ancient world. This is very interesting. There were asylums of certain kinds for the mentally ill or for the mad, but those also weren't prisons per se, right? They weren't viewed as punishment. You committed a crime, you weren't sent to a place to go sit with the mad. You dealt with the mad by excluding them from society, but it wasn't prison in the sense that we think of prison. So she says, prisons really are an invention of the modern period, and it's a punishment that fits the modern period. We discussed the penitentiary, and I know I didn't assign chapter 3. If you're interested in the birth of the penitentiary and these topics, I suggest to read the whole book, but chapter 3 is about this. And how does prison as a punishment works? Prison as a punishment is a modern invention. because it punishes you by taking away your rights. Right? The punishment of prison is to not be able to participate in society, to not have your God-given rights as a citizen. Right? Um, so, on the one hand, it's viewed as uh, more humane in that it isn't flogging, it isn't cutting off your hand, it isn't, as we mentioned, right, Hammurabi's law, an eye for an eye. Uh, but prison, she thinks, uh, is in some senses more destructive than corporeal punishment, corporal punishment. Uh, because in prison, in the penitentiary system, what is being punished and what's being punished is the soul. And thus, we view those who go to prison as having bad souls, as being criminals. Once a criminal, always a criminal. Right? So that uh, there is this permanent punishment that comes with prison and having been convicted, having had to go to prison. Um, there's a section she writes about Charles Dickens visiting the penitentiary in Philadelphia. And Dickens writes that it seems like the most horrific torture of any punishment that he's heard of. We kind of think of prison as in these humane terms, right? It's humane. There's no physical violence. There's no cruel and unusual punishment. Um, but Angela Davis spends some time talking about how cruel and how incredibly costly for an individual the punishment of prison is. To lose 20 years of your life for a crime, to be cut off from the world, from society, for some number of years. And she writes that the prison sentence uh, also fits in with the rest of the modern framework, right? It's like a wage, right? You have to go to work for a certain number of hours in order to make a certain wage. Well, you have to go to prison for a certain number of years in order to be rehabilitated. Right? It fits this work model. It's political system of the bourgeois state model. So we think that prison is humane, right? But it's if we actually experience it or look at it closely, it's torturous. Right? Uh, and the thing I think is interesting about this fact that um, in theory, what's being punished is the soul, and the punishment is taking away rights, is that because prison is about taking away rights, prison also then becomes a place to put people that you think should not have rights in the first place. Right? So the fact that prison is a place without rights means that coming out of slavery, uh, it was logical for the white supremacists who wanted to regain control to think, right? If they're not going to be enslaved, then right, Black Americans belong in prison, right? Because whatever happens, they can't genuinely be granted rights. Um, and I think that this continues today. Right? Why is it that uh, a black teenager is uh, 5 times, I don't know exactly the number, but 5 times more likely to go to prison for a minor marijuana infraction than a white teenager? Right? Why is a black person so much more likely to be pulled over for, having having a mirror ornament, right? Um, why is the sentencing for crack so much harsher than sentencing for powder cocaine? And the answer is, right, at a large historical level, uh, that right, in general, the law and the state treats black people as though they don't really have rights, right? Not the way white people have rights. Uh, and that because of this reason, right, it is somewhat natural, somewhat inevitable, and ultimately not really an injustice that black people should go to prison. Right? The absence of rights there is less less of a punishment ultimately than it is for white people. And we hear this sort of attitude play out in so many different ways. Right? Okay, so in chapter 6, I'm just going to say this quickly. Right? Angela Davis then presents alternatives for the prison system. And what she says is uh, roughly what we mentioned briefly in class on Monday, right? That to conceive of absolute prison abolition means to imagine a society that does not produce lawbreakers, right? A society in which um, everyone is sufficiently taken care of and the laws are sufficiently well written that there are only, very rare instances of lawbreakers. She says, right, what in this best case scenario would it mean to be a lawbreaker? It would mean uh, being recognized to be someone who needs to take responsibility for their actions, right? Rather than punishment for law breaking. Uh, one would, of one's own accord, take responsibility, make amends. And she tells this story uh, of a white girl who is killed in South Africa by um, by freedom fighters who were fighting to overturn the apartheid government in South Africa. And right, this white girl who was an American, was not part of the apartheid regime, was traveling there, and wrong place at the wrong time, ends up getting trapped in this sort of racial violence and being murdered. And she talks about how her killers forged a relationship with the parents of this girl, and um, said, I've done something. I've taken away someone that you love. I need your forgiveness, and I want to be your child now. Right? They take responsibility and try to make themselves accountable, try to make amends, and the victims of the crime, it's their responsibility to forgive and to try to right move past this crime. Idealistic. Um, but I think that the overarching point, you know, again, the great majority of people in prison are not those, dyed in the wool, innate criminals, bad people. Um, they are there as a result of circumstances, as a result of one mistake, or living in a world in which one has no other option but to break the law. And you know, therefore, in order to deal with mass incarceration, instead, um, what we need to do is create the communities, the institutions, the programs that will uh, edge out the prison, right? And I think the idea here is, so let's read what she says. The creation, uh, she writes on 107, 108, the creation of new institutions that lay claim to the space now occupied by the prison can eventually start to crowd out the prison so that it would inhabit increasingly smaller areas of our social and psychic landscape. Schools can therefore be seen as the most powerful alternative to jails and prisons. And so uh, the idea is, in order to abolish the prison, uh, what we don't do is all at once declare prisons illegal and let people out. Instead, it is a process of developing uh, these programs, these communities that can lay claim to the space the prison inhabits, right? And what that means is, we hear about the school to prison pipeline, right? That already in school and high school, prison is hung over people's heads, right? If you don't behave, you're going to end up in prison, right? So that school punishment and school discipline has been tied to the prison. Same is true of drug use and rehab, right? If you can't make it through this rehab program, then you go to prison. Prison is this omnipresent force, and so the idea would be we need to cut down on what we expect prison to handle. And this is her main point, I think. We conceive of basically any kind of infraction and law breaking as crime. And all crime needs to be punished. And all punishment that is not corporal punishment is imprisonment. Right? That's what we have. And her idea is to say, right, rather than thinking that all forms of law breaking are crime, we should make lots of distinctions and say, this is a crime. This is, in this case, the law was broken because of economic scarcity. In this case, because of mental health. In this case, because of, whatever, because of, well, those are the two main categories, right? And then, as we, sort of make smarter distinctions, rather than saying there's one group of people that are criminals, we can start to fashion what consequences are appropriate, right? And leave prison out. So the prison would be reserved at first only for the most hardened criminals, right? Last resort. And at the very least, what this would do is reduce the prison population by a large amount. And many of those crimes, circumstances that disproportionately affect the Black community would not result in imprisonment and punishment and the further deterioration of Black communities. Uh, Certainly wouldn't disenfranchise them. And this is, as a final thought, along the same lines of what's discussed under the rubric, under the heading of abolish the police, right? That what abolish the police means is to not think of every element of society as needing policing, but instead to say, an easy example would be to say, all right, well, police shouldn't handle stops. And traffic stops should be handled by a separate organization, and it should never go to the level of police. Right? That prison and talking to cops shouldn't be part of the traffic world. um, so that it's really right rethinking, not just learning the history of prisons, but then based on that history, rethinking what prisons are and how we deal with lawbreakers in general. All right, that's all for today. See you Monday.